I think some element of a free product or some sort of free self-service experience, and then paywalls after the user or the customer has found value. I see that as so important to keep up with the modern buyer or the modern user of software. I just see that as very tied into the future of software and technology.
Coffee's for closers only.
So we've established my proposal is sound in principle. Now we're just haggling over price.
Let's see how much we're going for on eBay.
Man, it's the same as Dunkin' Donuts. Costs 15 times the price.
Welcome to Impact Pricing, the podcast where we discuss pricing, value, and the fascinating relationship between them. I'm Mark Stiving. Today our guest is Kyle Poyar. Here are 3 things you want to know about Kyle before we start. First, he's written an incredible ebook called Mastering SaaS Pricing. Very well done. He worked for SKP Simon-Kucher Partners for 6 years as a pricing consultant. And a few years ago, he joined OpenView, a venture capital firm. I find the idea of pricing experts joining VC and private equity firms absolutely fascinating. Welcome, Kyle.
Thanks for having me on the podcast, Mark.
Hey, how'd you get into pricing in the first place?
You know, I went to Simon-Kucher straight out of undergrad. It's interesting. I was actually an environmental studies major, but this was back in the recession when there weren't a whole lot of careers, especially not in environmental protection. But I was fascinated by, so Frank Luby from Simon-Kucher came on campus and he talked about how people make decisions and how pricing is so central to decision making. And so how studying pricing is really both helping companies grow, but it's also better understanding why people buy what they do and how to influence that. And I just was hooked from the beginning. So joined Simon-Kucher right after graduating and spent a good 6 years there and have now been, I guess, in the pricing world for about a decade now.
And you've done nothing but pricing, although your title now is marketing, so I assume it's a little bit bigger than pricing.
You know, I always say pricing is kind of a Trojan horse, right? It's one of the most cross-functional things in a business. And if you work on a pricing project, you get pulled in to do pricing, you probably end up getting a ton of great insights around the different customer segments and the value of those segments, the sales process and how good the sales team is at positioning and selling your product, the value of new features, and also how to have profitable unit economics. And so the way I've thought about it is pricing is sort of the tip of the spear. It's a pain point that's universal among companies, especially among earlier companies. But then once you do a pricing project, you uncover so many areas of opportunity for follow-on work.
That's such a fantastic answer. Oftentimes when people say pricing, we think, or someone else thinks, oh, I have to put a dollar value on that thing, whatever it is. But it turns out that once you get into pricing, it's not only that very last, I got to put a dollar on it, but it's the market segment. It's how do we talk about our products? How do we talk about the value? Who values it? How much? And then you could even take it back to, are they building products or features that have value? Pricing is just pervasive. I couldn't agree with you anymore. That was amazing.
Putting the actual price tag on the product is, to me, like one of the most boring parts of pricing. And I get much more fascinated by everything that surrounds it.
What caused the jump from SKP over to OpenView? How did that happen? Why did you do it? Why did they do it?
So there's a few reasons. I mean, from my standpoint, I guess when you are in consulting for 6 years, a lot of people get an itch to start taking on a more operational role where they can really see the impact of what they're doing. And so I love the idea of moving, even though it wasn't a role that was totally in-house. It was a role where, we're long-term investors in companies. And so we can really see the impact of work and be closely connected with our portfolio companies throughout their journey. And that journey includes pricing and a whole lot of other changes they're going to make to their business. So I thought that was an awesome opportunity. I also found in my consulting work that while as a consultant, you sort of go where the money is, right? You work with clients that are going to have the ability to pay for a consulting project. In a lot of cases, that is larger, well-established, sometimes legacy businesses But I had so much more fun working with the companies that were fast growing startups. And it was harder for them to afford consultants. But when we did work with them, they were so open to new ideas. They were very data driven. They were not bound to the past. There was way less politics. And so I knew in my career that those were the kinds of companies that I was going to get most excited working at. But most of them don't really need a full-time pricing person. And so it was a great opportunity to be able to work with these kinds of companies and then see a variety of them. So that's more from my perspective. And from OpenView's perspective, an extremely specialized firm. We only invest in software companies at the expansion stage. And because we have such a focused investment strategy, we have built out a practice called our expansion team that's just dedicated to helping those companies grow. And the thesis is we're seeing, the same sort of patterns and the same kind of company that we can really have true expertise to help these companies identify what problems they're going to run into and help solve those. So OpenView, thankfully, already had put a big investment in the expansion practice, and this was just adding another part of that.
Were you the first pricing person on the expansion team?
I was the first person that came from kind of a pricing specific background. We had a couple other people that had been in the role prior to me that definitely did pricing projects and were fully aware of the importance of pricing. One person actually went and joined the monetization team at LinkedIn. And so certainly the team had recognized the value of pricing before, but I think that when I joined, we kind of turbocharged that effort and got much smarter about tracking the value for our portfolio companies of how much revenue they generated from pricing changes. And we were able to evangelize pricing quite a bit more.
Nice. And you're essentially taking best practices from one and teaching others. So it's almost like being a consultant that gets to stick around a little bit longer. Exactly.
And it's fascinating to me where companies, as they go through different stages of growth, typically are encountering a lot of the same packaging and pricing challenges. They might see their business as unique, but when you zoom out and compare it with a bunch of other companies going through the same journey, it's amazing the kinds of similarities that come into play. I mean, one of the most obvious ones, and I'm happy to talk about more, but one of the most obvious ones is that the early stages of a business, founders tend to undervalue their products. They start off with extremely low pricing, and they don't really change that and increase it as the products have matured. They built out new features. They've gotten smarter about selling the value of their product. Their brand is worth more. They make all of these investments, but they remain underpriced. And so there's just a ton of opportunity in the early stages of a business to increase prices, and in many cases, not even seeing any sort of impact to win rate or conversion, just additional revenue and bottom line profitability.
It is amazing that people don't understand the value that they're delivering, and it changes. It increases over time as you put more and more features on your product. Hey, before you address that, though, quick question: define expansion stage company for us.
Yes, it's a little bit purposely vague, right? Mm-hmm. So I guess what we see it is there's seed stage, right, where you're kind of validating an idea, looking for product market fit, and then the expansion stage comes once a company has that product in market, they've really shown clear signs of product market fit. You can start to evaluate the different metrics around a software business. So you can measure things like CAC payback or net dollar retention or the logo retention in their cohort. So you can start to really measure the business like a larger software company, even though they're still small. It's normally kind of single digits in terms of millions of dollars of revenue, but like probably 1 to 10, 1 to 15 million in annual recurring revenue is common. But customers tend to be quite satisfied with the product. And as you add sales count, that sales team is getting productive. So the total amount of revenue coming from new cohorts keeps increasing. So that's a company we would see as firmly in the expansion stage.
That was an excellent answer as well. Do you guys track LTV over CAC as one of the definers for you?
We don't track LTV over CAC, but we do look at the two essentially separately from each other. And so what we'll look at, and part of it is because of how early some of the companies are. They don't really have enough of a lifetime with their cohorts to track true lifetime value. But we are looking to see lifetime of a cohort actually increases over time, so that as you bring on new cohorts, after factoring in churn, that whole value of that new revenue you brought in keeps increasing over time. So they see net negative churn in the business. That's a huge signal for us. And then we want to see a CAC payback period that is able to support continuing to invest in sales and marketing. So normally that's sub 18 months, ideally less than 12 months. We've had some businesses with CAC paybacks as low as 1 or 2 months, but then we weigh that against the expansion characteristics in the cohorts, how defensible the product is, if there's a kind of a unique competitive advantage or a very large market size, or there's a number of factors that we also layer in.
Nice. Okay, I am geeking out and loving this conversation, but I'm picturing half our listeners saying, what's CAC, what's LTV, what's NDR? Guys, if you don't understand these, drop me an email and we'll try to answer those questions for you in email. This is just too much fun for me though, right now.
Well, and I geek out about benchmarks as well, though it's actually one of the first things I did at OpenView was spearhead our SaaS benchmarks initiative. And we now survey about 400 software companies every year. And we ask for metrics all around like their growth rates, their organization structure, their go-to-market strategy. Pricing is a big component of that as well. And we publish the results on our website. And so that's also a great resource for those looking to get smarter around SaaS metrics. You can just type in saasbenchmarks.com.
Excellent. And I love the articles and writings that you guys do. It's just really generous of you to put that out. I appreciate it hugely.
Well, that's great to hear. I mean, our goal is helping founders, especially of expansion stage software companies. We want to build a community around what it takes to grow a software company and also highlight trends that we're seeing in the market. And so I think we were probably one of the early VCs to do content marketing. I know our founder, Scott Maxwell, said that when he brought up the idea of content marketing for a VC, that everyone thought he was crazy, right? Like, why would a VC do content marketing? But now we're seeing, so many other venture capital firms doing the same thing because they realize it's a great way of not only getting your brand out there, but having people understand what it would be like to partner with you, get a sense of the kind of expertise and the resources that, you bring to bear as a potential partner for them. And so what we found that our community's been super appreciative of it. And our community's actually grown to, we have about 100,000 email subscribers now who get our weekly newsletter.
Nice. And it doesn't hurt. Maybe a company will learn something and be an investable asset for you one day.
It wouldn't hurt, right?
Hey, let's try to make this useful for some of our listeners for a second. By the way, I've loved everything so far, but let's talk about SaaS versus recurring revenue. Because I often hear the definition of subscription is this periodic payment. And yet when we think about companies like Uber, we get, especially if you're going to be in a city like New York, there's probably people who ride Uber every day or every month, and we have this recurring revenue. It's like we want to treat them like a subscriber, even though they haven't subscribed. Do you have a way to think about the difference between subscription and recurring revenue?
I mean, I think that the metrics that go into looking at the two kinds of businesses are very similar, right? You're looking at how much it costs to acquire different cohorts of customers, and then what is the overall sort of lifetime value and how repeatable is the revenue model. And so if it is a business that is recurring revenue but not subscription, but the lifetime value is low because folks stop using the product, that would obviously be a red flag. But if it's more of like a payments business, like a PayPal or a Stripe, where once you're locked in with a customer, they're not going to rip and replace their payment software. They might see some spikes, up and down in terms of their business growth, but it's essentially committed revenue, even though the amount changes over time. I think that what's so nice about that model is that while there is some more risk, right? You don't have the customer fully locked into a contract. It removes barriers to growth, and you can end up seeing just a lot of natural growth because you almost become, especially as a payments business, like an infrastructure that folks use and they don't even think about it. I think I would put AWS in that bucket as well. Yep. It's the cost of doing business in the B2B world. And I think that those businesses also, they have more pressure to deliver a great customer experience because if customers are not happy, they can stop using the product anytime. There's nothing stopping them. But, if you feel like you have the best product out there, you can remove a lot of barriers in the process of selling to a customer or getting in the way of a customer buying, and then see a great land and expand motion where you've got these great cohorts of customers who are very profitable. So that's some of the ways I think about it. I mean, one of our portfolio companies, I actually helped pivot from a subscription model to more of a regular recurring model. It's a company called Logical. They're in the legal tech space, and they do e-discovery software. And their customers or the prospects of theirs were really hesitant to buy, especially annual contracts paid up front, because they didn't know what their usage was going to be. They also don't have a ton of money lying around to pay for software, and they want to build this back to their clients. And so I worked with Logical to introduce a pay-as-you-go, totally non-committed model to make it easier for their customers to buy. And they actually saw 500% growth in their customer base over the course of a year. And the revenue really took off. It was hockey stick growth in the business because they were selling to the customer wanted to buy, and not necessarily the way that people were familiar with how a software business should operate.
Yeah, we sometimes want to force, everybody wants to go subscription today, and it feels like we want to force fit every business model into subscription. Not that subscription is a bad thing, but in some cases it may not be ideal.
Exactly. And subscriptions, it's a great business model for a lot of companies. And obviously investors recognize that and are willing to pay a premium for subscription companies, but you can get a lot of the same characteristics without actually having any sort of commitment for your customers. And that can be a disruptive value proposition. And I think investors will recognize companies that are, disruptive and winning in the market and reward them.
Yeah. It's funny because you said the word commitment a couple times, and I don't think of subscriptions as having commitment. I use a million different subscription businesses, but let's just talk about Calendly for a second, right? I use Calendly to schedule meetings. I could cancel them at the end of this month. So there is no real commitment. And yet I subscribe to them. I'm going to pay them every month, just like I would use Uber if I lived in New York. Does that make sense?
It's fair. But Uber could offer a monthly subscription, right? Where you're pre-committing for that month of how much you want to use Uber, instead of deciding, on a Monday, I'm going to use Uber today, and I'm just going to pay for that single use of Uber. So there is a commitment, even though it's a small commitment level. And actually, it's a good shout out about Calendly. They're a portfolio company of ours, and they've got a great business model.
Okay, I didn't know that, but glad I could help.
Always be promoting, right?
Yeah, exactly. The reason I push back on commitment a little bit is because I think one of the biggest advantages to subscriptions is that our customers don't have to make the big commitment. Think about buying a perpetual license versus a monthly subscription, and the level of commitment is minuscule.
Definitely. I think in general, we've seen a trend away from huge upfront fees, customers getting locked in, and instead of having that on sort of the on-prem license maintenance model, then moving to like a SaaS world and multi-year contracts and then annual contracts. And I think now we're in a world where people expect much lower barriers to getting into a product. And so monthly subscriptions, which have much less commitment, or then purely pay-as-you-go models, freemium models, are certainly taking off. And I think looking at the success of companies like Zoom or Slack, it shows how great some of those business models can be. And I think Slack is actually a good example, per your point, where for their plans, they charge based on the number of active users in a month. And so they'll actually credit you if some people were inactive in a month and didn't use Slack. They'll give you a credit for your account. Totally fair billing. And so not only is that not like committing you into an amount of users for a year or multiple years, but it gives you total flexibility. And if you just stop using it, you're not paying for it.
Yeah. Let's talk about bundling. Let's talk about this usage thing again, because I find all these fascinating, and I like to push on the edges of things that aren't overly clear. Your research shows that users is the most common pricing metrics by far. And then second is usage. And when we think of usage as a pricing metric, companies often bundle those into the packages that they create. So when they create a good, better, best package, it's usually pricing metrics as one of the things they put in there. Do you differentiate packaging from pricing metrics in your mind?
They're definitely interrelated for sure. And we're seeing packages get increasingly sophisticated in terms of thinking about, because to me, I mean, the main goal that I have when I'm working with a company is I want to have multiple axes to be able to land and then expand a customer over time. Those axes could be through the value metric alone, which could be users, the amount of usage, or another metric entirely. And then you've got packages, which could be some sort of combination of features, of usage, of services, and what have you. And so I think to me, the first thing I look for is how do you get those multiple expansion routes, which is just so important for a business to be able to grow over time. And then what I think about metrics is I tend to be looking for the primary unit that determines what kind of value a customer receives, like what's most predictive of value. But then you're also looking for something that's acceptable to the customer, that's predictable enough that they can budget for it and buy it, that they accept, right? That you also have the systems to be able to bill around, and which I think billing systems are finally catching up to the way pricing people want to approach pricing for products. But I think a lot of companies realize users are, the most common value metric out there, but aren't totally right for a lot of businesses. Like for an infrastructure monitoring software, just the number of users that are going to log in to monitor your infrastructure, is that really predictive of the value a customer gets? Or is it more about the size of those applications that you're monitoring and how mission critical those applications are? And so I think that I prefer a usage metric if we can find one that's acceptable for customers. And then if we can't, I like coming up with another metric like users, but working usage into the packages of the offerings to try to bring some of that kind of customer value and connect that with what people are paying.
When you see pricing metrics, and let's say that we're actually going to charge for the pricing metric, whatever it happens to be. So it's the size of the infrastructure that we're monitoring at the moment. Do you still put those into tiers, or do you tend to charge by the unit? And now we're getting back towards that recurring revenue versus a subscription thing almost.
It really varies. I mean, I think to me, the kind of ideal type of model is more of like the Twilio model, where you can pay for it on as it's used basis, and you don't necessarily need to make a commitment, purely pay as you go. And that's super developer friendly, especially. But then once you get to a certain amount of spend, and you get to a level of predictability in your usage where you're not just trying something out over time, you can get volume discounts for committing to a certain level of usage. And that's a win-win for both the customer and the vendor, where the vendor gets that predictability and that higher commitment, and the customer gets discounts off the pay-as-you-go price. And then there's still normally kind of some overage charges or different language on the event that the customer ends up, using a lot more than what they had initially committed to. But I like that model where it's a combination.
Nice. Yeah. I got two more big questions for you. First one, what do you see as the biggest pricing problem that subscription companies are having today?
The biggest pricing problem. That's a difficult one. I mean, I think structurally speaking, and this is probably not as useful to the audience of this podcast, but I think structurally speaking, companies are not spending enough time on pricing. They don't take a scientific or kind of a rigorous enough approach to optimizing their pricing and testing it and collecting data on it. And we've gotten smart about just about everything in technology. And if you look at the level of sophistication of the operations of a tech company, it's just so different from where we were a few years ago, but pricing hasn't really. And I've started to hear companies that are trying to bring on pricing talent, make their first dedicated pricing hire and have that happen earlier in their life cycle. But then those companies are having trouble figuring out what's the right profile to hire for, who's going to do a good job in this role, and then finding that talent. And so I think structurally, the biggest challenge is just lack of lack of great pricing skills. And then more tactically for businesses, it's a very competitive world in technology right now. It's never been easier to start building a product and getting something released. And what I think that means is that most businesses are finding that they have more competitors, that when they make a product change, that gets copied faster. And so there's increasingly the commoditization of features, where we're seeing features where, like if you look at a Salesforce integration, for instance, or a single sign-on integration, that used to be a premium feature for like the top tier packages. And now it's something that people just expect. Like if you can implement it yourself with Zapier, why should you have to pay, thousands of extra dollars to buy the more expensive package where this is included? And so I'm seeing a commoditization of certain features, and it's hard to keep pricing power in the market.
Yeah, I think that's pretty common in most technology businesses where, technology evolves. You got to stay ahead of the competition. You can't just always capture the same value you used to capture. By the way, on the first point you made, I think every listener that's still with us today is sitting there saying, would you please call my CEO and tell him that?
I mean, it's interesting though. I evangelize quite a bit the importance of pricing, but I think the biggest aha moment for CEOs is when someone finally tracks the revenue impact of pricing changes and they start counting all of the dollars that they're making from making a pricing change. And you go from seeing a company that maybe has not made a pricing change in 4 or 5 years and it was extremely resistant to a pricing change, to a CEO that wants to now all of a sudden change prices like once a month and that's all they think about for the next quarter. It's amazing that if you can bring proof points around impact and real dollars and cents, I think you can change minds quickly.
Nice. Last big question for you, Kyle, if you don't mind. What's the one piece of pricing advice you would give our listeners that you think could have a big impact on their business?
One piece of pricing advice. If I had just one, that would be, I could probably make a lot of money off of that. But I think to me, that one of the biggest trends that I'm seeing with our portfolio and in the companies that are IPOing, so over half of the IPOs from 2018 and 2019 have been companies that OpenView says, or we would categorize as product-led growth companies, where the product is at the forefront of how they acquire, convert, and expand their users. And so we're just seeing this trend where companies that have an element of product-led growth can grow faster than their peers and can do so in a way that's more efficient. And these businesses, a lot of them have free trial models or freemium models, but I think some element of a free product or some sort of free self-service experience and then paywalls after the user or the customer has found value, I see that as so important to keep up with the modern buyer or the modern user of software. And they don't necessarily want to have a lengthy demo. And it's also just really expensive to acquire leads. And so to the extent that you can bring some virality and bring like a whole lot of demand for your product through a great free experience, without distracting from the paid experience, I just see that as very tied into the future of software and technology. And many pricing people are probably not as comfortable with those models. But I think if you start getting involved in thinking about what that model could look like and what are the KPIs for it in your business, that elevates the role of pricing in the organization and helps you stay relevant with your users. It certainly requires you to understand the packaging. What are you going to let people have for free? For how long? What's going to happen there? So I think that's a fabulous answer. I've heard other investors talk about trying to design the sales force out of the system. And that's pretty similar to product-led growth. Would you agree? Yeah, it's very similar. I think that to me, you shouldn't necessarily have sales as a roadblock to the buyer being able to have a great experience, but you can sort of recraft the role of sales. And there can be people in these models, but sales starts to act more like a consultant or as a product expert It's almost more like customer success. You're automating a lot of the process of, if instead of having an SDR cold calling folks and then, a detailed sales qualification and then a demo and then a solution validation and all of these steps and a lengthy sales process, you can automate a lot of that away for sure.
I once worked for a firm where the sales force's job was defined as helping buyers buy. All right, Kyle, thank you so much for your time today. This has been fantastic. If anyone wants to contact you, how can they do that?
Thanks for having me, Mark. Feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn, or you can follow me on Twitter at Poyar K.
Poyar K. Excellent. And episode 20, already done. That was nice. Kyle was absolutely brilliant. If you got value out of this podcast, would you please help us out? Subscribe, leave a review, tell a friend. Every little bit helps, and we are hugely appreciative. Also, if your B2B company needs to better understand subscription pricing, check out our new subscription pricing course. If you'd like to learn more about the course or have any suggestions or comments, please drop me a note at mark@impactpricing.com. As always, don't forget to listen next week to another episode of Impact Pricing.